Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Democratic Resilience track of the Warsaw Security Forum. I'm really, truly honored to address such a distinguished group of policymakers and practitioners, and I'm really happy to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, so thank you for joining us. We gather today at a pivotal moment, where democracies across the globe are being constantly tested by a range of increasingly sophisticated threats, from disinformation and the weaponization of AI to the rise of populism and cognitive warfare. All of these threats are not only multidimensional, they're also rapidly evolving. And as we counter them, the most important thing we should remember is that our greatest asset is our ability to adapt and respond to these threats collectively as a community of like-minded nations. The talks that you will hear in this room today reflect the complexity of the challenges that we face. We'll start with a panel on disinformation. Disinformation has become one of the most powerful tools to erode trust in institutions around the globe through social media manipulation, through deepfake and fake news in general. And that panel will look at how to counter this almost invisible yet ever-present enemy. After that panel, we'll have the pleasure of hearing the remarks of Polish Minister of Justice Adam Bodnar, who will deliver his remarks on populism and the future of Europe. And that particular speech is especially timely, given the rise of populism around the world. Then we will transition into a discussion about the different dimensions of total defense. Total defense is no longer just a military concept. It encompasses all of society, and the panel will reflect that and discuss the different nuances of this term that now is also a reality. Then we will transition into a discussion about one of the most geopolitically sensitive regions in our neighborhood, the South Caucasus. The South Caucasus has been for years at the intersection of great power politics, and we'll hear about the current state of democracy there. Then we will transition into another very interesting set of talks about AI and the future of technology. We'll talk about how AI is impacting the economy and security, and we'll answer questions such as, how can we harness AI for the benefit of society while making sure that it's not being weaponized by our adversaries? How can we introduce effective, fair, and equitable AI policy while still not stifling AI adoption and innovation? Those are some of the questions we'll discuss. Later in the afternoon, we'll also have another set of talks that touch upon AI and specifically look at competitive advantage in technologies in Ukraine. We will also hear from 3 co-founders of different startups, technology startups, and we will talk to them about how they have integrated AI in their solutions. So I hope you stay around for these discussions as well. We will also have a conversation about one of the most insidious modern forms of warfare, which is cognitive warfare. Today, the battle is not only for territory or resources, it is for our minds. And in that discussion, we'll talk about what is cognitive warfare, how to counter it, how to build societal resilience, and how to make sure that our adversaries are not exploiting our cognitive vulnerabilities. We will also have a discussion about critical infrastructure and how to protect it, and also about Belarusian democratic society. Both of these talks remind us that every aspect of our lives contributes to building democratic resilience. So as we go through all the talks today, I encourage you to think about the common themes in them that bind them together. And if you walk away with one lesson, I hope that it's this one. Democracies are fragile, and we must protect them. We must protect them by building democratic resilience. But building democratic resilience is not a one-time task. It's a continuous effort that has to be woven into our society, into our institutions, and into our daily lives. And only in this way we can ensure that democracies not only survive, but thrive in the face of adversity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the talks ahead.
Thank you, Biljana. Ladies and gentlemen, a well-deserved applause for setting the stage for our discussions today. Please, I also encourage everybody to use your social media handles, tweet, go on X or Twitter, how it's called now, go on LinkedIn and other platforms. And please, I also extend a warm welcome to all our viewers online. Please engage with all of us today. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the first panel of today's track. It will be the panel of Facing the Invisible Enemy, Disinformation Around Us. Very important discussion, one of the critical challenges that we need to tackle in the democratic resilience space. And to lead this panel, it's my great honor to welcome Mr. Jonasz Rewiński, the news anchor for TVP World, which I also encourage everybody to watch, a great and growing Polish global news channel. Jonasz, please, if you can join us on stage.
Welcome to our first debate devoted to the question of disinformation. My name is Jonasz Rewiński, and first I would like to introduce our guests today. Carrie Filipetti, Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition. Welcome. Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member for the Bertelsmann Foundation. Pasi Rajala, State Secretary in Ministry for the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And Nikola Dimitrov, former Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration of North Macedonia, and also President and co-founder of the Balkan Center for Constructive Policies. Welcome. So, of course, disinformation, generally the question of narratives, has been high on the agenda, especially during a year where there are many election cycles going on. And the fight against disinformation is somewhat unusual, being both something that happens in the spotlight, but also being veiled in shadows by its very nature. This is an issue that sometimes is very unclear as to its origins and as to its objectives. So let me first ask you a question concerning the democratic resilience. Obviously, this is one of the main themes here. So to what extent would you say disinformation is a major threat to democracies in this day and age? Carrie Filipetti.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this panel talking about this issue. And I would say the question of is this a threat, I would say not only is it a threat, but I actually consider this one of the #1 national security threats facing the world. You mentioned that this year is a critical election year. About 49% of the global population by the end of the year will have elected new leadership. So this is significant for everybody. At the same time, we're facing a world that not only has direct military conflict happening in the Middle East, happening in Europe, of course, and potentially happening in the Indo-Pacific, but all three of those leading adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran, are investing hundreds of millions to billions of dollars into trying to implement disinformation to essentially foment disunity within those democracies and try to attack them from within. So just to give you a sense of how much is being spent, the U.S. estimates that China spends about $7 billion annually on global disinformation. Russia spends about $1.5 to $2 billion internationally every year, and Russia spends in the hundreds of millions of dollars internationally. This is going into TikTok, this is going into social media, this is going into campuses. It's really affecting around the world people's resilience to democracy. So I consider it the main national security threat that we're facing today.
So, Nikola Dimitrov, what about your experience? Because your country has been targeted by Russian disinformation insofar as the question of European integration is concerned. So apparently the Russians want to exploit the dissatisfaction of the long wait for EU accession.
Yes. First of all, great to be here, and in particular to be able to speak on this, I fully agree, an extremely important topic, probably the biggest challenge facing democracies around the world, because the backbone of any democracy are informed citizens. when citizens are misinformed or disinformed, especially in an orchestrated, manipulative way, then we have a challenge, and this is the year to look into this problem, given so many, the last one being Austria, if I'm not mistaken, many important elections ahead of us, including, of course, the United States. Now, the Russian narrative is, to a large extent, a narrative that spoils European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration in my region, in Southeastern Europe, or the Balkans. So one of the obstacles that we have faced, and this has been lingering for almost 3 decades, was a dispute with Greece we had. I was involved in that personally for about 18 years. As foreign minister, I negotiated and signed the so-called Prespa agreement, which was a compromise, difficult both for North Macedonia and Greece. And the narrative, the battle of narratives was so important. At the moment, Greece expelled Russian diplomats, actually, from posted in Greece. The opponents of the agreements used essentially sort of the same ammunition, saying that our government received 150 millions from Greece to actually give in. But on the same side, the Greek opponents of the compromise also accused the then Prime Minister Tsipras of taking money to give in. So the day we had a referendum that was overwhelmingly positive, but short of the threshold to be valid. On the day of the referendum, when the results came in, there was a fake letter of my resignation from the post of a foreign minister, in a way adding to the mood, to the narrative that this has been a failure. The agreement enabled my country, North Macedonia, to join NATO, and we became the 30th NATO member state, something we've been trying to do since the early 90s, essentially. So I don't know whether we are at a stage where we should discuss solutions, but in what we do in Skopje, apart from debunking fake news or disinformation, which is reactive, and your colleagues, journalists, usually say that once the damage is done, it's really difficult to undo it.
Difficult to reverse, isn't it?
It's a bit like throwing a pillow full of feathers from a helicopter, and you need to pick up all the feathers to control the damage. So in addition to debunking, what's important is to invest in credible media, to offer serious, fact-based content, because the answer to fake news is not only debunking, but it's also real news.
So we have a few solutions here. That brings me neatly to the next question pertaining to how we should react to disinformation. We have a success story from North Macedonia and how political successes were achieved despite disinformation. But this is an ongoing battle, isn't it? Daniela, Schwarzer, what would you say about countering disinformation on a European level? We had European elections recently. We know that there is a growing threat from far-right parties, and these are often exploiting mechanisms related to disinformation. So what would you say should be the most important thread in the ongoing struggle against disinformation when it comes to EU involvement?
Well, first of all, I think it is extremely important to recognize that those who spread disinformation are usually organized across borders in very many ways. So if we speak about Russian disinformation, you can track that in disinformation that comes into one European public sphere usually spreads to other countries as well. And very often there seems to be a synchronized approach. So I think, first of all, debunking and exchange of information, of ongoing campaigns, is really the first step. And the European Union has been pretty active on that for quite a long time. I remember the creation of a unit that served to debunk Russian disinformation starting after the annexation of Crimea, so basically roughly 10 years ago. But right now we have other origins of disinformation that are very present in our public spheres, Russian, Chinese, Iranian, so we need to be much broader. And we also need to recognize that also domestic actors, of course, spread disinformation. But one thing is debunking and informing, and also, as Nikola said, spreading right and positive news and trying to cover the public space and be present with what's actually happening. That's one thing. But I think we need to go much deeper and think about how our citizens can be enabled to cope with disinformation. Because you cannot expect either public authorities or entities which are created, be they civil society funded, or be they half public, half private entities that serve to debunk disinformation. That's only the last step. What we really need to do is we need to enable citizens to work for themselves, basically to be more media literate, to have fora to exchange upon those issues. And I can speak from our very practical experience as a foundation. We worked over the past 9-10 months, we worked with 120 citizens from across Germany, all walks of life, all education backgrounds, all kinds of also personal stories and backgrounds randomly selected, who were asked to work on the phenomenon of fighting disinformation. And they made suggestions which are very holistic. And it really starts with education systems need to be preparing children for this new education environment. And then they go through all levels and also end up with expectations towards governments. And what is really interesting, because we did some polling on the side, is there is a huge number of citizens who today say they are worried about disinformation. 81% of Germans said in our polling, we know it's there, we are worried because it is destructive for our democracy. And there is a strong expectation also for governments to actually do their part in fighting disinformation.
So that is an excellent point, and in fact, Pasi Rajala is here, and he might actually be able to share some experience that Finland has, being a country that recently was at the very top of a ranking insofar as information literacy is concerned, but also a country that has introduced specific measures, educational measures in particular, to address disinformation back in 2014. So can you share some of your experience with us?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. Obviously, it's an uphill battle for all of us. It's much easier to be destructive than to be constructive. But I fully agree with what colleagues said. It has to be a whole of society approach, not only whole of government, but whole of society. And it starts, again, with education. In our model, because we have been living next to Russia, for so long, we have established this whole of society approach to defense. And in our book, communication space is just another domain of defense. And then it, again, it starts with educational curricula, with basic education where media literacy is part of the curriculum. And of course, we are working with civil society organizations. The government is doing its part, even businesses. They see their role in this whole of society approach. But again, I mean, it's an uphill battle, and there are no easy solutions, to be honest.
And I think one really interesting example of how society is taking part in this struggle is a phenomenon you might be familiar with, NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, a grassroots movement operating online on X, formerly known as Twitter, and actively struggling against disinformation, fighting disinformation and exposing it, even though it does not really have any sort of government funding or anything like this. But when we're talking about the ability of governments, the ability of organizations to counter disinformation, there is also the big question of big tech companies. Since disinformation mostly flows through social media nowadays, is enough being done insofar as limiting the scope of the various bad actors to post disinformation online being done by social media companies? Well, Carrie, Filipetti, what is your take on that particular issue? Because it is difficult. On one hand, you have to balance freedom of speech, but on the other, the introduction of binding regulations.
Yeah, well, I think Nikola really said it perfectly in that in order for democracies to function, we really need an educated populace. We need a populace that has access to facts and makes decisions based on those facts. When the facts are in question, which we have seen happening on basically every issue. I come from the United States, and so during an election season, it gets particularly bad. When people don't have access to facts, they might be operating under the best intentions with the most patriotic goals, but they're not able to do to vote for or push for the thing that they most care about. The challenge of democratic systems is the same thing as its beauty, which is we have to be authentic about the fact that it's challenging to balance all of these different principles, the freedom of speech, but making sure that people have access to accurate information. That's why I think when Daniela mentioned that education is such a key piece of this, I really think it is, because the problem with the idea of kind of regulating social media, the regulators get it wrong a lot. And because they get it wrong, once you get it wrong once, this is what we're seeing particularly in the United States, you had massive campaigns. The best example that I can use is COVID-19. It's a controversial example, but I think what's important to state is that when we talk about disinformation, it's easy for us to say this is disinformation, that's not. But in the moment, it is not easy to do that. And in COVID-19, in the United States, there were all of these regulations and attempts to censor any theory that suggested that maybe this originated from the Wuhan lab. Now, it's unclear exactly where it originated from, but the fact that for years it was labeled as disinformation to even suggest that it had originated somewhere other than the wet market is part of the problem, because that has then radicalized other people. So sometimes regulation ends up pushing people in the wrong direction because we don't in the moment actually know what the true information is. And so to that end, I really agree with Daniela that the solution here is inoculating the population. It's not necessarily, yes, there has to be some way of regulating, and I think part of this has to go into the idea that social media algorithms are specifically created to generate the same type of addiction response that drugs are, which is a huge problem for all of our children just on its face, but particularly as it relates to disinformation. So I think there are things to be done there, but I don't think the solution itself is the regulation. The solution is the inoculation, the media literacy, and making sure that our citizens have the tools to recognize disinformation for what it is.
So Daniela Schwarzer, because this is a very interesting topic here, and even Josep Borrell, the Foreign Affairs Chief of the European Union, has once said that disinformation is, and I quote, a cancer that puts the health of democracy at risk. So the big question is, do we rely on individuals to try and, basically be aware of the first signs of this disease, or do we also introduce regulations? The European Union did introduce some of the regulations that we're talking about. How effective do you think are they at this stage? And would you say that we need more regulations, or perhaps we should go in the other direction?
Well, it takes, as we, I think, agree on this panel, an all-hands-on-deck approach. And the platforms play a huge role. I think regulation is necessary, and we heard just now. But I also think that self-engagement of platforms could and should be necessary. I'll give you an example, and that is the spreading of disinformation on health. I think platforms, we don't need detailed regulation to tell them what to distribute or what not to distribute, but they should, for themselves, come up with ideas how to, for instance, certify information that is spread on areas that are so important to the safety of individuals. And health is one example why disinformation, as Josep Borrell said, is as dangerous as a cancer spreading in a body. First of all, it can, in fact, put individuals at risk. And the recommendations how to fight COVID by taking substances that will really possibly kill you, as we have seen in some countries spreading, those are dangerous moments. And I think responsibility is with those who manage information on their platforms. And then secondly, the destruction of trust that comes with disinformation is huge. And mostly decision makers in top government positions are targeted. But what we also see is that disinformation really destroys trust in institutions that are important for society. Let's take the health system, for example. Let's take schools. Let's take other places where citizens go and where they should feel they are in a trusted environment. And if disinformation really works its way into societies and more people start believing that they cannot trust their neighbor, basically, their school teacher, because everyone seems to be dangerous, I think then we know how deep the problem is. So we need to work on this issue on all levels. And we spoke about education. Of course, the first focus should be schools. But we also need to look at those segments of society who have long left school. They weren't educated for this new information environment. So we need to find ways to reach them and inform. And I would say platforms and media definitely have a huge role to play there.
And that again is a great point, because if you have people only just being introduced to this brave new world of the internet, they might actually not be able to separate fact from fiction. But there is another thing also, and that's a slightly controversial topic. What if social media platforms are actually being accused of engaging in promoting and or disseminating fake news? We have this ongoing debate about the role that Elon Musk is playing. And some people say the quality of public debate has deteriorated, that he has been amplifying sources of a questionable nature, so to say. Pasi, Rajala, what would you say should be our approach in that kind of case, if the responsibility is upon these platforms, and yet it is not being discharged by their owners to the full extent?
Obviously, social media are key players in this, within democratic nations, but also globally, in the global south. And we have data how Chinese and the Russians are targeting even younger and younger people. I mean, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, and trying to influence their thinking. What to do? Obviously, there are different types of social media platforms. X is basically owned by one single person, so it's difficult to deal with that besides regulation. And I agree that regulation is one aspect, and the European Union is a big regulator. But it's not the only solution. We should appeal to, I mean, there's a big trend of corporate responsibility in the world, but where's the corporate responsibility of these big tech companies? We should take them to task on that. And then there are other platforms. TikTok obviously is, I mean, it boils down to government, even party control. So it's a different animal altogether. I think, as was pointed out by, I think, Nikola, is that once the disinformation is out there, it's very difficult to reel it back. It's very difficult. Of course, we have to call it out. We have to call out disinformation. But the best approach is to be proactive, to push our own agenda, get the facts out there, talk about, in this global context, what are the benefits of having a democratic model which respects human rights. And end of the day, it's a question of investment. We heard how the Chinese and Russians are investing. Our democracies investing equally strongly. And the European Union here again is a key player.
And Nikola, Dimitrov, pretty much the same question. What is your take on that?
The EU Disinfo Lab is an entity that deals with this issue quite deeply. And what they said, they looked into how platforms reacted to debunking. So disinformation is revealed, brought it to the attention of the platforms. The reaction was lacking in 45% of the cases, and the leading platforms in the opposite way leading, so from the bottom, were YouTube and X, or former Twitter, 75%. So out of 4 debunking instances brought to their attention, the reaction was to 1. And I think obviously we have an issue here. Social media are key in this manipulation with people and what they know and don't know. In Finland, for instance, they went through presidential elections, and Google search in Finland and Google search in France of the Finnish presidential candidates differed significantly. The recent, in June, the European elections, hundreds of paid political advertisements were lacking the necessary disclaimer in countries including Poland. So I think while media literacy, part of compulsory education of citizens, all that is necessary, but I think we still have a job to do with the platforms and their own responsibility, because they're the carriers of news and fake news.
With great power comes great responsibility. That is a quote from popular culture that is very much adequate in this case. Since we're slowly nearing the end of the debate now, perhaps some questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Hi, Melissa Murphy, United States. You spoke about access to facts, but there's a very insidious aspect of disinformation, and that's who's identified to receive the information and why. Nikola, you described a form of targeting. And agencies in the United States assert 1/3 of all Americans are targeted by their digital exhaust. The legislation, Section 230, is hotly debated for holding social media accountable for contesting disinformation. But what are your recommendations and concerns regarding digital exhaust?
I'm happy to start. The targeting of specific individuals is a key aspect here. Russian disinformation, for example, is trying to specifically target the American right. We are seeing how Iranian disinformation is trying to specifically target the American left. And frankly, sometimes they try to target both because they don't actually care. The thing to remember about disinformation, sometimes they care about the actual information that is being put forward. Other times they just want to get people arguing and fighting and losing sight of sort of what it means to be an American and why we're all connected to ourselves and to democracy, and make it seem like maybe democracy isn't the best system that's out there. So we see them targeting in different ways. Specifically as it relates to social media, which I think is obviously a key part of this discussion, a lot of the targeting is for younger Americans. We see that up to 90% of Gen Z individuals say that they use TikTok at least weekly for their news. We are seeing that that's closer to about 50% as you get older, and it gets very small as you reach obviously more senior populations. The one thing that I think is really important that we highlight, though, is that my concerns about regulation, and I agree regulation matters in some respects, but ultimately it actually is legal for me in the United States to say something A, hateful, and B, wrong. That is legal for me to do. It's legal for Elon Musk to do. So the question is, what makes disinformation a separate category that allows us to regulate it more? And I think there's a couple components to that. This is why Congress has specifically targeted TikTok, because of its foreign ownership and because we know that the CCP uses it in order to disseminate its information. So I think we just need to be mindful that one of the main challenges that social media presents to us all is that in the United States, at least, and I can't speak to other countries represented here, you're allowed to say whatever you want to say unless it meets two specific standards. One is, that whole example of calling fire in a movie theater, and the other is fighting words, right? So you can't incite people to violence. The problem with social media is you don't know who's receiving the information and what kinds of weapons, whether they're physical weapons or not, they have in their possession. So it's a completely different category, which is why I think regulation is a part of it, but probably not kind of central to it. The reason why the youth are being targeted is specifically because their education rate, frankly, is a lot lower. We look at fourth graders in the United States, only 43% of them can read. And if you can't have basic literacy, then you won't have media literacy. So this is why it all goes back to, in my view, Daniela's main point of this is an educational problem, and we need to inoculate specifically those communities that are being targeted by these campaigns.
And that is a very good point. I mean, in some cases, you also have this sort of nesting doll approach. You have an attractive current issue like woke culture in the media, but then the same influencer is also going to talk about like different issues, like saying, oh, if you're listening, look, spending money on Ukraine doesn't make sense and all that. And all of a sudden, you actually are getting into this next level of...
And we have to be careful that we don't just categorize the things we disagree with as disinformation, right? And that's part of what's happening within, we're talking about the framing of this is where we're within an electoral process in the United States and with, I think it's 64 other countries internationally this year. So when you're in a moment like that, there's obviously going to be a lot of rhetoric, a lot of hyperpartisanship, but the problem is everybody says that what the other person is saying is disinformation. You can disagree with it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's disinformation.
No, of course, it's something that's manifestly untrue, like Ukraine is a dictatorship. I mean,
Correct.
That is
Correct.
manifestly not
Correct.
true, and yet you see this in the ongoing debate. Now, I think we do have time for one more quick question from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. Mantas Adominas, new Secretary General of the Community of Democracies. I actually want to build on what you said in these remarks. Isn't it the case that we've been talking about disinformation, I think, for close to 10 years already? And the progress has been fairly conspicuous by its absence. But isn't it the problem that when we start tackling disinformation through regulation, actually it evolves into trying to regulate all these things which are false, like all the health disinformation. It's not hostile. It doesn't arise from state actions. It's born out of obscurantism, stupidity, and simply ignorance. But when we try to tackle disinformation in this broad aspect, then we get kind of sunk in this morass of trying to educate society, and that's a kind of project which has been going since Enlightenment. Shouldn't we be more focused on hostile state actions like China, Russia, Iran, and identify these acts of disinformation as a primary target of regulation and not try to kind of transform society in as a whole?
I'll just very quickly weigh in. I apologize. I feel like I'm talking the most, and these folks are way more expert than I am. But I would say I agree with you, and I think what we also need to remember is that if the solution to disinformation is government censorship, then our adversaries, whose whole purpose is to undermine democracy and undermine freedom of speech and undermine American and international values, that gets achieved. So in some respect, their goal is achieved if we over-regulate, if we over-censor. So that's why we have to be really careful. And this is not an easy solution. I'm not suggesting, that there's nothing that can be done here. But I do think we need to really dive into these questions and understand that we have a lot of competing things here, and we need to take it seriously, because if we get it wrong, then we will be playing into their hands just as much as if we don't combat it at all.
And perhaps one of our guests would like to contribute to this issue?
Well, let me just say that I think there are two things happening at the same time. One is the spreading of disinformation, more and more sophisticated means used, videos that are created by AI, voice that has been artificially created. So the credibility of those pieces out there is higher when people consume it, and that's a big problem. But at the same time, and I think that's the point you were just alluding to, our political debates are getting more polarized, and some of the positions which may not be nice are not illegal or even illegitimate. And I think we have to get used to a debate which we have to develop a sane political controversy, a culture of controversy, but in an environment where we do our best to try and control and exclude actual disinformation that has a destructive purpose, but still stand our grounds in huge political controversy, because that's really the matter of our time at the moment. We have so many changes going on, so many challenges to our countries and societies, and we must be able to stand those controversies, because if not, governments that have been democratically elected will be accused of censorship, and that is already happening. And that, again, undermines credibility to a very large extent.
So it is a difficult balancing act, and it is a truly fascinating discussion. I wish I could say that we have much more time to discuss all this, that we can ask many more questions. Unfortunately, if I did so, that would be disinformation. But in any case, Carrie, Filipetti, Daniela, Schwarzer, Pasi, Rajala, and Nikola, Dimitrov were our guests today. Thank you very much for your contributions and for sharing your insight.